Good morning, Westeros! And welcome to this short little video that I wanted to throw together real quick and get out alongside the first episode of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. In this video, we will take a completely non-spoiler look at the Targaryen family tree, specifically for the Targaryens that are alive during the timeline of the new show, A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. For those who might not know me, my name is Nelson. I'm from the Morning Throners podcast. We normally do a chapter by chapter or episode by episode podcast on all the Game of Thrones books and shows. Myself personally, I am a huge fan of the Night of Seven Kingdoms novellas, which are the novellas that the new show is based on. This first novella, the novella called The Hedge Knight that this first season is based on, might be my favorite book of all time. It's definitely my favorite of all the Game of Thrones related A Song of Ice and Fire books. And Dunk, the main character of this show, is one of my favorite characters in any fiction I've ever read. So, the main focus of this will be the family tree of the Targaryens. But before we get into that, I want to just quickly set the stage on what the show is about and when it takes place in relation to the other shows. Those of you that know me know I love my timelines. So, to be quite technical, we're going to hit some actual dates and then I'll just give you kind of a brief summary. Aegon's conquest is 0 AC. That's what AC is supposed to mean, after conquest. So Aegon takes over, that is 0 after conquest. The House of the Dragon show. The very opening scene we see there where there's that council with the old King Jaehaerys where they pick Viserys king. That takes place in 101 AC. So pretty much exactly 100 years after Aegon's conquest. The main bulk of House of the Dragon focuses on a war called the Dance of the Dragons. That really kicks off in 129 AC. So that's where the bulk of the show takes place. Now, the next 2 points I'm going to throw up are not necessarily things that most people might know of, but just bear with me, it'll make sense a little bit later. In 184 AC, Aegon IV dies. He's just a king, Aegon IV, one of the kings, and Daeron II is named king. And in 196 AC, the Blackfire Rebellion happens. Basically, there is a rebellion against that King Daeron II, who is named king. We'll talk about this a little bit later, and it's not super important for this show. We're just going to touch on it. But Daeron II is king at this time, the time when this takes place. So this rebellion is kind of recent history that will probably get brought up. So, the Tourney at Ashford Meadow, the thing that this show is focused around, this new upcoming A Night of the Seven Kingdoms show, that takes place in 209 AC. And then to catch us up with Game of Thrones stuff, Robert Baratheon was named king in 283 AC, so that's the end of his rebellion. That's, again, going to be quite a few years before the show actually starts, but I think most people who know Game of Thrones will be familiar with that. And then the very first chapter of A Song of Ice and Fire and the very first scene of the show of Game of Thrones, where they're north of the wall, that takes place in 297 AC, the end of 297 AC. Most of the first Game of Thrones book takes place in 298 AC. So that's the technical timeline. A brief overview, kind of like a good way to look at it is Aegon's conquest. We haven't seen that on screen yet, but that's basically when the Targaryens took over, is 0. 100 years after that is the Dance of the Dragons. That's what we see in House of the Dragon. 100 years after that is this show. Then 100 years after that is Game of Thrones. So it's not quite, but it's close. You're going to be off by a decade or two here or there, but it's about every 100 years is so far the shows we've got. Okay, so now that we know where this show takes place in relation to the other ones, let's just set the stage a little bit. This show will follow a main character called Dunk, who's just a lowly hedge knight. If you don't know exactly what a hedge knight is, that's okay. I'm sure they'll explain it in the show. For now, I think this clip from the trailer will sum it up close enough.
What's this? It's a hedge knight, ain't it? What? It's like a knight, but sadder.
We're not sad.
So the hedge knight we'll be following in this show is a fella named Dunk, a lovable lunk who I personally can't wait to see on screen, alongside his wise-mouthed little squire Egg. The main focus of this first season, as shown in the trailers, will be a single tourney. It's a quaint little castle called Ashford. So unlike Game of Thrones and House of the Dragon, this show has a much smaller scale. And the whole show, or most of the show at least, should be from a single perspective, that being of Dunk. Also, this whole season, which is only 6 episodes, should really only cover a couple days, unlike Game of Thrones again and House of the Dragon, which can span years. So, with that background set, why am I making a video about the Targaryen family tree? There are 2 main reasons. There are quite a few Targaryens that show up at the tournament, and I know keeping the names in relations to each other can be difficult for some of these shows. Secondly, there is a bit of history, specifically the thing I mentioned in the timeline, the Blackfire Rebellion. While not directly related to the events that this show will cover, in-world is a major recent political event that the realm is still pretty sensitive about, and thus I expect it to be mentioned a decent amount. Not too much, but a decent amount. This is slightly interesting for book readers because it's actually not mentioned at all in the first novella, which is what this is based on. However, that's because technically George wrote the first novella pretty early before he wrote a lot of the other A Song of Ice and Fire books. He actually wrote it before Clash of Kings, which is the second one. So this was his second A Song of Ice and Fire book to be out. And at that point, he just hadn't invented the Blackfire Rebellions, pretty much. So he thought of it later on, and then it becomes extremely important in the next two novellas. So that's why I think that George probably would have mentioned it in this one a little bit if he could have, if he had thought of it at the time. And that's why I think it's good for the show to do it, just to kind of drop some hints for things that'll happen probably in season 2 and 3 of the show. All right, with that all out of the way, let's get into the timeline. I'm trying to keep this video pretty short, and I don't expect anyone to memorize all this stuff, so feel free to take a screenshot or come back to the video after an episode or two, and I think some of this might make a bit more sense. All right, so here we are with the timeline. It doesn't look too bad, and I'm about to actually clean it up, so it's going to get even easier to look at. However, I'm then going to make it a little bit messier. So, let's start off here. Current king is Daeron II. He's at the top here. Now, why Daeron II's family is important is because 2 of his sons and several of his grandchildren attend the tournament. So now let's take a look at who is going to attend the tournament. I'll say the 2 brothers that do are Baelor and Maekar, the eldest and youngest. These 2 in the middle, while important, not important for this story. So we're going to remove them from this family tree real quick just to simplify things. So Aerys, he's going away. So is Rhaegal, along with his wife and children. Okay. So we've trimmed the timeline down to just Baelor, Maekar, wives, and children. The ones that I've circled with this yellow circle, maybe I could have chosen a better color there, but the ones with the circles are characters that we should see. They should be in the show. They're all in the novella. Baelor, Maekar, siblings, get along, but there's kind of, the way I take it is probably like a little bit of sibling rivalry. Neither of them should be competing, but their children will probably be competing in the tournament. Again, this is just kind of like a little tournament. I'm not going to say what it's celebrating or what it's why they're throwing the tournament, and it's not really a spoiler, but again, I'm trying to keep this as spoilers free as possible. But Baelor and Maekar, they're getting older, so they're not taking part. They could. They're definitely fighting age, but they're letting the children do that at this point. So Valar, Aegon, and Daeron should all be participating in jousting at this tournament. I guess the other thing you'll notice if you look at this keenly, one of the children of Maekar I have named Maester Aemon. Again, I don't think that's a spoiler for this show. That is a kind of a cool connection. One of Maekar's children actually is the one that grows up to be Aemon in the Game of Thrones TV show. Now, if you go through and listen to every Maester Aemon scene and listen to everything he says, there might be some spoilery stuff for the Hedge Knight, so I wouldn't do that. I would not go back and watch Game of Thrones, and if you do, just don't pay super specific attention to everything Aemon says, because I'm pretty sure there are a few name drops that might spoil some of this and maybe even the future A Night of the Seven Kingdoms seasons. And a few of these guys we actually have pictures for already. So let's throw those up real quick. I think that'll be for Maekar, Baelor, and Aegon. Again, nothing crazy with these pictures, but the one thing I will point out here is Baelor, who, again, now you can't really see the names. Here, let me move the pictures, actually. Okay, there we go. I've moved the picture so you can see both the name and the picture now. So the one interesting thing I want to point out here is Baelor is a Targaryen. He's the heir. He's the eldest son of Daeron II. He has brown hair. I don't know if we've seen this at all. Are there any Targaryens with brown hair in House of the Dragon? I'm not sure, but there should have been. So I guess first point, there should have been a few. They took it out. I think it's fine. It makes it probably confusing for viewers. Why are there, normally if you're used to Targaryens having this white hair, silver hair, why are there a bunch of Targaryens that have brown ones? So I think it's fine. There are reasons for it in the books, but to simplify things, I think it's fine to leave it out. Here though, Baelor will not have silver hair. Valar, I think, also won't have silver hair. And Daeron, I think, as well won't have silver hair. So the other two that I have circled here that we don't have pictures for, I think they both, what did I just say, will not have silver hair. So just kind of one interesting thing to keep note of is not all the Targaryens in this show will have silver hair. The other thing, as far as the other siblings, I don't know if we can say if they'll be here. Maester Aemon, I don't think should be. He should probably be at the Citadel at this point. But like as far as Matari's or maybe Valar's wife, Kiera of Tyrosh, or maybe even Baelor or Maekar's wives, who knows? Maybe they might show up in the show. They're not in the books, but they might show up in the show. So the next part of the family tree we're going to take a look at is something I mentioned when we were going over the timeline real quick. And that is what the Blackfire Rebellion is and how that relates to what's going on here. So let me expand this family tree again. Also, I will say that none of this information is really relevant in this season of the show at all. Flat out, period. However, I expect there to be a decent amount of name drops of these people. So why would they be name dropping all this complicated history that isn't really relevant in the current season of TV we're watching, especially if we're on limited time with only 30-ish minute episodes? Well, it's because the next two novellas, which the show is based on the novellas, the next two novellas do incorporate a lot of this history. Again, the rebellion already happened, so it doesn't take place during the history, but the history is much more important, and you'll see what that means when we get there, and if you know, you know. So, yeah, let's get into it. So, the ones in black, these are Blackfires, or it's not actually that clear cut. The ones in black come from bastard lines of Aegon IV. We look at him, he's kind of the Targaryen in the top middle. I never mentioned, this is kind of color coded. All the light reds are Targaryens. Everything else, I kind of tried to match it to one of their colors in their sigil, the main color of their sigil, if possible. These black squares are Blackfires, descendants of Blackfires, or what we'll call Great Bastards. And by Great Bastards, I'm talking about Brynden Rivers and Aegon Rivers, those two black boxes towards the right. So before we get into that, I'll say for the most part, you don't have to worry about the grandchildren of Daeron. So none of Baelor or Maekar's children here. When this history was taking place, they were all probably not alive at that point or too young to be relevant in the politics of what's going on. So let's start at the top with Aegon IV. Many of you might know of him if you know anything about Targaryen history. He is one of the, if not the worst, considered probably the worst king. He just slept around a lot, had a lot of bastards, and then on his deathbed, legitimized all his bastards. This ends up causing problems. Specifically, it causes problems with one specific bastard, Daemon, that he bestowed Blackfire to. Blackfire is the sword that has always been passed down to the Targaryen kings. I think we've actually seen it in House of the Dragon. So he bestows the sword of Blackfire on Daemon at one point, and then later, when Aegon dies, he legitimizes all his bastards on his deathbed. Sometime later, again, it's not right on the heels, we mentioned that on the timeline, it's not right on the heels, but sometime later, the Blackfire Rebellion happens. And basically what that is they decide that Daemon Blackfire should be the rightful king, not Daeron II, who after Aegon dies, Daeron II, who is king at the point of this story, is the king after Aegon dies. So there's a rebellion. Daeron II clearly wins because he's still king at the point of the story, and the Blackfires lose. But it is a pretty big political thing. There are a decent amount of battles, and it did kind of divide the realm. There were a lot of people that did side with the Blackfire side. Brynden Rivers, so this black box kind of in the middle, while not legitimate, he sides and fights on the side of the legitimate Targaryens. So although he's a bastard, he doesn't actually fight on the side of the Great Bastards. Great Bastards, again, being the bastards who were legitimized by Aegon IV. So Daemon, Brynden Rivers, and Aegon Rivers. I think there are other bastards. There are definitely other bastards. I think these are always considered the Great Bastards, though, especially the ones relevant for this rebellion. One last little update to this. All right, I threw some circles up again. Different color now. Red, again, probably not a great color, very similar to the Targaryen red I used, but whatever. These circles are trying to represent who was heavily involved in the Blackfire Rebellion, right? So again, the Blackfire Rebellion, this moment of history that takes place about 10 years before the events of the show that we're going to be watching. Who was really heavily involved in there? What names would I expect to be name dropped in relation to each other? Pretty much the people circled here. Like I said, Daemon Blackfire, he's the king who rebelled. Aegon Rivers, who's another great bastard. Also, there's two nicknames that I threw up there. Aegon Rivers most of the time goes by Bittersteel. He was pretty much the major supporter of Daemon Blackfire. A lot of people say that Daemon Blackfire never would have rebelled if it wasn't for Bittersteel's urgings. Again, I said Brynden Rivers. He also goes by Lord Bloodraven. He fights on the side of the Targaryens. And you'll notice that I also recircled Baelor and Maekar. That's because they fight on the side of the Targaryens, obviously. And I guess you could call them heroes from the battle that they fight in. They are notable. There's one particular battle that they kind of work together to crush the enemy. I guess they kind of flank from either side. They're referred to as the hammer and the anvil in that case. But yeah, I would just expect these types of people. Again, I'm trying to avoid spoilers. If they do want to get into this, I want them to get into most of it in the show. So without avoiding spoilers for what's going on there. But yeah, obviously Targaryens win the rebellion, or else we wouldn't be. It would be a different story we're seeing. So that's what's going on. And I will say one more time that while this rebellion is not relevant to the story at all, it is way more relevant to the next two novellas. So probably the next two seasons of A Night of the Seven Kingdoms. And for that reason, I expect them to be name dropping some of these people to lay the groundwork for the next two seasons. So hopefully you guys enjoyed this. Hopefully I kept it short. I actually can't see how long we've been recording for, But yeah, take a screenshot maybe, and then feel free to refer back to it when you're watching the show. Thanks. Leave a like, leave a comment, and we'll see you guys in the next one.